Hey everyone, thanks for tuning in. If you're new here, consider subscribing. It really helps keep these stories coming. And while you're here, let me know in the comments where you're listening from. Now, sit back, relax, and let's get into the story. My name's Will Calder. I've worked offshore rigs most of my life. This one's called Deepwater Titan, located about 150 miles southeast of Galveston, Texas, floating over the Walker Ridge Block in the Gulf of Mexico. It's a massive, semi-submersible drilling platform, state-of-the-art, deepwater capable. Most people back on land wouldn't know it exists. But we live and work out here, weeks at a time, cut off from the world but connected just enough to know when something goes wrong. And something went very wrong. It started with a corporate bulletin, issued 3 days ago over the secure comms network. At first, it sounded like an overreaction to a bad flu strain or a biolab accident. The mainland had gone into containment status, whatever that meant. Then came the real kicker. All crew on all offshore assets were to shelter in place until further notice. No crew changes. No inbound vessels, no medevacs. All helicopter flights were grounded. We got that transmission the same night our satellite feed went dark, just static. But we still had marine VHF, and through CH-16, we started hearing chatter. Disjointed, panicked, and eventually, silent. We were 112 men and women at the time, working in staggered shifts around the clock. Engineers, drillers, crane operators, logistics, and the catering crew. Our OIM, the offshore installation manager, was a sharp old school guy named Trevor Hess. Ran the rig by the book. 35 years in the industry. The kind of man who could spot a malfunctioning blowout preventer by sound alone. That night, Trevor called a full muster in the main galley. Everyone who wasn't on safety-critical duty, meaning those who weren't actively maintaining the BOP stack, compressors, or mud pumps, had to report. The galley was packed. The big overhead lights flickered occasionally, as they do when the emergency generator tests cycle through. No one touched the food. "I'm not going to sugarcoat this," Trevor said, arms crossed over his Nomex coveralls. "We've been told to shelter in place. All outbound flights canceled. That includes the Sikorsky S-92 scheduled to take the night crew home tomorrow." Groans rippled across the room. I saw Javier Ortega, one of our mudloggers, slump back against his chair and mutter something under his breath in Spanish. He'd already done 5 weeks. He was due off rotation. Trevor raised a hand. "Listen, we've got full supplies, triple redundancy on power, and enough diesel in the tanks to run for months. Food for 6 weeks minimum, water plant fully operational. We're safer out here than anyone on shore." I was hard to argue with. The rig was a fortress. Steel bulkheads, sealed watertight doors, and the only way in or out was by chopper or boat. But Trevor's face gave away something else. There was fear behind those eyes. Real fear. And that was before the chopper came. Day 3, 11:07 a.m. I was up on the production deck with Elena Tsai, our chemical engineer, running a standard check on the corrosion inhibitors. The Gulf was calm, mirror smooth. We were joking about how the fish below us had no clue what was happening on shore. Then the noise hit Tritor blades. We both looked up. There it was, a black Sikorsky S-76, coming in fast and low from the west. "No flights were cleared," Elena said, pulling off her goggles. "Not unless the lockdown was lifted," I said. But no one had informed Trevor. Within minutes, the entire command staff was scrambling to the helipad on the upper deck. I followed, along with a few other crew. The OIM demanded answers over the handheld radio, but all we got was a burst of static and a single, heavily distorted voice. "Priority evac, corporate order." We need... The chopper landed hard, skids scraping. The side door opened before the rotors even stopped. 4 people stepped out, 2 men in business suits, 1 woman in an HSE uniform, and the pilot. They looked off, pale. One of the execs stumbled forward and vomited on the pad, blood mixed with bile. The other coughed violently, spraying droplets onto the door of the stairwell. Elena backed away. Get them quarantined, now. We tried. Trevor ordered them straight to the medical bay on level 2. I helped rig medic Adam Denali load the worst one, an older man, name badge reading C. Hendricks, onto a stretcher. His veins were bulging. His skin was ice cold. His eyes weren't focused. The woman in the HSE uniform kept murmuring something about containment breach and level 4 clearance. Less than 3 hours later, Adam was dead, and Hendricks was standing upright, tearing into the HSE rep's throat with his teeth. There's no emergency protocol for this. We had plans for blowouts, hydrogen sulfide leaks, even piracy, but not whatever the hell this was. The infection spread fast. By the time we locked down level 2, it had already breached the galley via the air duct system. We lost 15 men in under 10 minutes. Cooks, electricians, even Roger Bledsoe, our derrick men, who'd served 2 tours in Afghanistan and looked like he could bench press a car. I barricaded myself on level 4, the drilling floor, with Trevor, Elena, and a dozen others. We sealed off the stairwells with emergency bulkheads and jammed the elevator systems by manually disengaging the power relays in the mechanical shaft. But it was a temporary fix. The infected didn't die unless you took the head. One of the deckhands, Mick Traver, figured it out when he smashed a fire axe into the skull of a screamer who had cornered him near the laundry chute. Up until then, we'd just tried to knock them back. Bad idea. These things didn't stop. They didn't feel pain. And the worst part? They remembered just enough to move with purpose. They operated doors. One of them even activated a call button for the freight elevator. Not exactly mindless. By the end of the first night, we were down to 23. Trevor tried to reach corporate via satellite phone. No response. The marine radio on channel 16 was silent, but I began trying to reach other rigs. There are at least 12 semi-submersibles in this quadrant of the Gulf, including the Jack St. Malo and Cascade FPSO. At 4:32 a.m., I got a ping from the Petronova skimmer, a support vessel 40 miles northeast. The captain, Andrea Voigt, replied briefly before cutting transmission. Her last message: "Don't refuel. Stay off the Titan. Something's wrong on board." They knew. Trevor and I made the decision to go down to the BOP control room on level 1 to initiate a hard lockout of all onboard crane systems. If the infected gained control of the cranes, they could lower lifeboats or even attempt to signal passing vessels. It sounds absurd, but these things weren't stupid. One had tried to climb the emergency ladder Shaft tried. We got there with 3 others: Elena, Mick, and a roustabout named Keisha Rains. The halls on level 1 were empty, eerily clean. No blood, no bodies. Just silence. The kind that makes you hear your own heartbeat. Then came the sound of chains dragging. Mick raised the fire axe. That's not wind. He was right. Something was moving below the grating, inside the cable trunk. Whatever it was had figured out how to use the rig's maintenance crawlspace, and it wasn't alone. We locked out the cranes, jammed the winch motors, and began manually disabling the elevator controls on each level. It was the only way to slow them down. I crawled into the tight service duct and used my multi-tool to snap the hydraulic feeds to the elevator pistons. That way, if someone tried to summon them, they'd fall or stay stuck. That's when the power flickered. Just once. But it meant something had hit the generator room. We made it back to level 4 by 6:11, just before sunrise. Trevor was silent. His hand was wrapped in gauze. He wouldn't say what happened, but I saw the bite through the cloth. "We hold this floor," he told me, "no matter what." But I knew what that meant. I looked around at the others. Elena loading the last of the fire extinguishers as improvised weapons. Mick welding a door shut using a portable oxyacetylene kit. They were strong, skilled people. But this wasn't our fight anymore. This was a last stand. We had about 20 people left. That number would drop soon. I could feel it. The infected had made it up to level 3, and we were already hearing thumps from the reinforced stairwell. Not random banging, measured strikes. They were testing weaknesses, listening for movement. Waiting. I hadn't slept in over 30 hours, but adrenaline had taken full control. Trevor's condition was getting worse. The fever had set in. He hadn't changed yet, but I saw the sweat beading across his forehead and the twitch in his jaw. He knew it too. That's why he pulled me aside and gave me his master override keycard. "This gives you access to the comms panel in the bridge," he said, handing me the red plastic badge, the kind that normally stayed locked in a fire safe in his office. "Use the card. Send the warning. Blow the diesel pumps if you have to. Just don't let anyone else dock here." I took the card. It felt like someone had just dropped a 10-pound steel weight in my hand. Getting to the bridge meant crossing the upper maintenance deck and going through the observation corridor. Both were likely crawling. The idea was to move through the upper ventilation shafts that ran behind the bridge's equipment racks. There was a tight maintenance duct between level 4 and the bridge that techs used for wiring upgrades. Normally, you'd need a harness and two-way comms just to enter it, but I wasn't going in there to replace fiber optic bundles. Elena volunteered to cover my approach. She had a pipe wrench slung through her belt and a belt of zip ties wrapped across her torso like bandoliers. She wasn't military, but she moved like someone who'd taken self-defense seriously. Years of working in hazardous chemical control probably gave her a healthy respect for worst-case scenarios. We timed it for when the emergency generator cycled. The power system on the rig staggered slightly every 40 minutes to offload load between the main diesel gensets. The flicker in the lights would create a moment of shadow, just enough to mask movement past the observation deck windows. I climbed into the access duct just above the galley, using a hand wrench to pop the grating. The metal squealed under my weight, louder than I expected, but I slipped inside, chest down, crawling inch by inch. The duct was barely 3 feet high, a tight box of steel panels and wiring. It smelled like grease and seawater and mold. Every foot forward echoed through the walls. My belt snagged twice on bundles of Cat 6 cables. I had to slow my breathing to avoid passing out from panic. This wasn't a place made for human movement. It was a tunnel of knives, bolts, and crushed dreams. Below me, I could hear them. The infected. They didn't walk in straight lines. They didn't grunt like in the movies. They muttered, soft, almost intelligible phrases. "Help me," one of them said. It was a loop over and over. "Help me." Like the brain was still firing in fragments. The first time I heard it, I froze, thinking it was a real survivor. But I knew better. That voice had no inflection, no soul. Just mimicry, a memory played on broken hardware. It took me 15 minutes to reach the final crawl space just behind the communications rack inside the bridge. From this angle, I could see through the cracked vent and into the room. There were at least 3 infected, one pacing near the window, hands twitching at its sides, another kneeling on the ground as if trying to remember how to pray, and the third slumped in the corner, twitching violently as if mid-convulsion. One of them was the pilot from the chopper. The room was dim, red emergency lights casting shadows like veins across the ceiling. The main comms panel sat across the room, mounted behind a transparent aluminum case with a biometric latch. That's where the override keycard came in. All I had to do was distract them long enough to make the move. I backed out of the vent and followed the duct to a side grate that dropped into the bridge's cable management closet. It was a narrow cabinet space used to house junction boxes and radio buffers. I pried open the grate and slipped in, landing softly behind a steel rack full of junction relays. I had one weapon, my fire extinguisher, not for firefighting, for blinding. I counted down in my head, 5 seconds, 4, 3. On 0, I kicked the rack forward. It crashed to the floor with a deafening metallic bang. Instantly, all 3 infected lurched up. Their eyes glowed faintly under the red emergency lighting. Pupils dilated. The one by the window charged straight at the sound, knocking over another panel in its frenzy. I used the moment to break left, sprinting around the bulkhead, extinguisher in hand. I aimed for the face of the pilot zombie and unleashed a blast of CO2 straight into its eyes. It screamed, a raw, rattling sound, as it flailed backwards into the corner. The other 2 turned. I didn't hesitate. I slammed the extinguisher into the kneeling one's skull, felt something crack. It went down. I leapt for the comms panel, yanked the card from my pocket and slammed it into the override slot. The case hissed open. I hit the broadcast switch and flipped the radio to channel 16, International Distress. The microphone buzzed to life. For a second, I thought it wouldn't work. Then I heard static. Open line. This is Deepwater Titan. Repeat, Deepwater Titan. To all vessels within 70 nautical miles, do not approach. We have active biological contamination on board. Do not refuel. Do not dock. Quarantine protocol Zulu Tango Charlie is in effect. Repeat, do not dock. I repeated the message twice, switching to channel 70 and 13 for redundancy. Then I activated the ship's AIS beacon override, changing the rig's status from operational to do not board, hazardous contamination. It was the closest thing we had to a red flag in the maritime world. Behind me, one of the infected got back up. The one I'd cracked with the extinguisher lunged at me, blood drooling from its half-collapsed jaw. I dropped the radio and rolled under the main comms table, crawling for the exit. A hand grabbed my ankle, cold, vice-tight. I kicked hard, connecting with its elbow. It screamed again, more like a modem shriek than a human voice. I scrambled out of the bridge, slamming the emergency bulkhead behind me. I didn't stop running until I reached the ladder well and began climbing back toward level 4. Back in our safe zone, the situation had worsened. Trevor had collapsed during a fever spike. Elena and Mick restrained him with 2 extension cords tied around a bolted-down locker. He was convulsing, but still breathing. Keisha had gone missing, last seen heading to the tool room to grab welding rods. We found blood near the hatch, no sign of her. But my message had gone out. We knew the tankers on the weekly refuel schedule would pick up the AIS signal. Some of them might even hear the radio broadcast on loop. It was the best we could do to warn them. Now, we had to think long-term. The infected had reached every level, except the flare deck and the crown platform, over 170 feet above the drill floor. We couldn't stay in the same place anymore. We'd have to move upward. The elevators were dead. The stairwells were compromised. But the derrick, the massive tower above the drill floor, was still intact. And at the very top was the crown platform, barely the size of a small bedroom, with a maintenance shack and a satellite dish cluster. We could make that our final redoubt. At least from up there, we'd have a view of the ocean. And a last stand. Mick looked at the others. We climb at night, rope harnesses, no lights. It would be a 170-foot vertical ascent on an open derrick ladder, exposed to wind, rain, and the cries of whatever was still hunting us below. But we had no other choice. The derrick was built for function, not survival. A lattice tower of steel and cable designed to hoist drill pipe and casing, not people fleeing a biological nightmare. The ladder ran up one side of the structure, bolted into the vertical supports, exposed to the open air. There were no safety rails, no platforms for rest, and no lights. Just cold steel and open sky. Climbing it meant leaving everything behind. Once you were up there was no fast way back down. We moved at 2:40 during the shift turnover lull when most of the infected had gone quiet. Whether they needed rest or simply waited in darkness, we didn't know. But the rig felt still, too still. The humming generators below were the only sound, backed by the distant rhythm of waves lapping against the pontoons far beneath us. Mick went first. He was the strongest climber and had spent the past year training for rope rescue certification. He wore a harness clipped to a braided safety line that he fixed along the ladder with carabiners. Elena followed, then me, then two more survivors, Curtis Harrow, a wireline tech with old football injuries, and Tessa Brune, one of the rig's mechanical fitters who'd spent more hours crawling through drill pipe than most of us had in our beds. We ascended in silence, each of us separated by 6 to 8 feet to avoid overloading the rungs. Below us, the glow of the rig faded to an eerie red as the last working lights flickered under emergency protocols. I gripped the cold metal with everything I had, forcing myself not to look down. The ladder groaned with each step, but it held. 50 feet, 100. The wind picked up at 120 feet. Gusts screamed through the derrick trusses, whistling like a predator's breath. Rain began to spit sideways, sharp and cold, making the rungs slick. We climbed slowly, methodically. Every breath was tight with exhaustion and fear. My forearms burned, but I didn't stop. I kept my focus on Elena's boots above me. Her right one was taped at the toe, the leather long worn out. One foot after another. Just stay with the boots. At 165 feet, we reached the crown platform. It wasn't much, just a steel grate floor bolted into the top of the derrick, surrounded by a narrow pipe guardrail. A small enclosed shack housed the control panel for the top drive and crown block sensors. That's where we set up. We pulled ourselves into the space, dripping wet, muscles trembling. But we were up, and we were alive. We secured the hatch and used a locking carabiner to keep it from opening. From up there, we had a view of the entire rig. What we saw chilled us. The entire production deck below us was crawling. At least 24 infected moved in erratic patrols, not random, not aimless. They were searching, lifting hatches, tapping on walls, circling equipment bays. One climbed up to the BOP access ladder and then back down. They were mapping the rig like they still remembered the layout, like they'd worked here once. A few gathered around the main stairwell, where we'd previously welded a bulkhead shut. One slammed its fists against it rhythmically, 3 times, pause, then 3 again, over and over. "They're communicating," Elena said, her voice barely a whisper. Pattern-based, not just instinct. It wasn't the first time we'd noticed it. Some of the infected could speak, at least partially. Others displayed behaviors that suggested hierarchy. A few seemed to follow a larger, slower one, possibly the chopper executive, Hendricks. His infection had come first. Maybe he changed into something more than just a drone. As we huddled in the cramped shack, we took stock. We had a Marine Band handheld radio, 3 bottles of water, 4 protein bars, a climbing rope, and 1 flare gun. The flare gun only had 2 rounds. It wasn't a weapon, it was a last resort. Our plan was simple: hold the high ground, conserve energy, and maintain a transmission schedule using the marine radio to repeat our warning every 30 minutes. I modified a repeating beacon by wiring the push-to-talk switch into a countdown timer salvaged from a pressure sensor. It wasn't perfect, but it worked. For 12 hours, we stayed silent, watching, listening, resting when we could. Then the supply vessel appeared. Around 15:20, just as the clouds began to break, we spotted it on the horizon of Port Royal, a contracted resupply ship. A 300-foot DP2 vessel outfitted for long-term offshore support. She was still 20 miles out, but closing fast, guided by her AIS system and autopilot. If her bridge crew hadn't heard our warning or hadn't received the AIS override, they'd try to dock with Titan. We had maybe 2 hours. Mick grabbed the binoculars, watching the white hull slice through the waves. She's got a clear line in. We need to stop her. We can't do anything from here, Elena said. We need access to the flare control deck. That was the other tower, the one that jutted out from the rig's side, suspended over the ocean by a steel boom and catwalk. It held the emergency flare, used to burn off excess hydrocarbons in case of pressure surges or gas kicks. It also housed a manual ignition trigger hardwired into its own power source. If we could override it, we could ignite a flare burn, something dramatic enough to signal danger. But the flare control was 2 levels down, back into the belly of the beast. At sunset, we climbed down. We moved fast, descending through the derrick frame under cover of darkness, stopping just above the top drive platform. From there, a suspended catwalk connected to the flare boom. We crossed it slowly, balancing over grating that creaked with every step. The sea stretched in every direction, blue-black and endless. A reminder that no help was coming. It was just us. The flare shack was unlocked. Inside, I found the manual trigger, an old-style lever system with 3 safety switches. I powered the system, aligned the burner, and primed the feed. The MV Port Royal was only 10 miles out now. I looked to Mick. You ready? He gave me a tight nod. I pulled the lever. The flare ignited in a massive column of fire, 60 feet high, bright orange and thunderously loud. It roared like a jet engine, lighting the sky and casting a terrifying glow over the rig. Instantly, the infected below reacted. Screams echoed upward. Dozens of them surged toward the flame, toward us. We ran. The catwalk shook as we sprinted back to the derrick. Below, the deck swarmed. One infected leapt for the ladder, trying to climb. Mick kicked its hand free and it fell, 20 feet straight down onto a railing. Its body folded unnaturally, but it still moved. We reached the crown platform and watched as the Port Royal slowed its approach. The flare had worked. We could see them turning. They'd gotten the message. But the infected had begun to climb. 3 of them were halfway up the derrick. We had minutes. Elena pulled the climbing rope from her pack. We rappel, she said, down the other side, onto the drill floor through the service bay. It was insane, but it was our only way down without getting swarmed. One by one, we clipped in and dropped. I hit the deck hard and rolled. The others followed, dropping onto the drill floor where the infected hadn't reached yet. We ran through the mud bay, past the pump room, and into the auxiliary tunnel network that ran through the pontoon arms. There was one more plan, one final option. The Deepwater Titan was a semi-submersible rig with large floating pontoons beneath the surface, massive ballast-filled structures that kept the entire platform buoyant and stable in the water. Inside those pontoons, besides ballast tanks and structural supports, were the overflow diesel tanks used to store backup fuel. Buried in one of the auxiliary control rooms inside the portside pontoon was a secured panel that controlled the vapor purge and ignition sequence for those tanks, a fail-safe for catastrophic fuel venting in the event of structural damage. It wasn't intended as a weapon, but that's what it had become. We reached the first blast door to the pontoon tunnel. It was closed, but still powered. Elena swiped Trevor's master keycard across the access panel. The light blinked green. The door opened with a hydraulic hiss, revealing a narrow passageway stretching forward into darkness, just 4 feet wide and lined with gauges, pipes, and salt-coated valves. The smell of oil, mildew, and brine hit us immediately. The air was damp and cold, far removed from the heat above deck. We advanced in a staggered line, flashlights sweeping the narrow space ahead of us. The tunnel curved gently downward as it descended into the lower hall. Metal under our boots rang with each step, echoing through the confined corridor. I counted every footfall, every breath. We didn't speak. There wasn't time. Midway through, we reached a flooded section. A burst pipe had left ankle-deep seawater across the corridor floor. It wasn't dangerous in itself, but it meant the pressure systems were failing. The rig wasn't going to float much longer. At the far end, we found the ballast control room. It was half submerged in darkness, with emergency LEDs casting a blood-red glow across the console panels. The main diesel purge interface sat against the back wall. An old analog system built before remote digital controls had been retrofitted onto newer rigs. The ignition sequence required 3 manual keys, inserted and turned within 10 seconds of one another. That's why Trevor had only given me one. The other 2 were here, in a locked drawer behind the console. I found the drawer and forced it open with a pry bar. Inside were 2 steel keys marked Purge Ignition and Vent Arm. I handed one to Mick and one to Elena. No speeches, no drama. We all knew what this meant. I inserted mine into the left console. Mick took the right. Elena crouched down to slot hers into the panel below the circuit relays. We waited for my signal. 1, 2, 3. We turned the keys in unison. The system buzzed to life. Warning klaxons began to sound, low, pulsing tones that hadn't been used in over a decade. A synthetic voice announced, "Ignition sequence armed, fuel vaporizing. Detonation range, 40 meters. Evacuation required." We had 5 minutes. Back through the tunnel we ran, water splashing behind us. The walls began to vibrate slightly, just enough to make the steel ring like tuning forks. Above, we could hear something heavy moving along the upper deck. Whether it was the infected chasing the sound of the klaxon or something worse, I didn't know. But we had to get off the rig. Elena yelled ahead, "Emergency boat deck is gone, covered in them." I had one last card to play. "The ROV deployment hatch," I said, gasping. "We use the launch bay, dive straight into the water." Mick's face twisted. "That's a 30-foot drop. Better than 40 meters of fire." We turned hard, bypassing the stairwell and heading down a side corridor toward the moonpool access. The ROV bay was located just beneath the drill floor, used to launch remotely operated vehicles down through the moonpool for seabed inspections. Normally it was sealed, pressurized, and flooded only when launching subs. But now it was open. One of the infected had smashed through the glass partition earlier. Salt water surged beneath us. The surface shimmered with reflections from the emergency lights overhead. One by one, we clipped into a tied-off safety line and swung out over the edge. I was the last. I took one final look at the rig, smoke curling from the flare stack, the lights flickering, movement in the shadows above. Then I jumped. The water hit like concrete. I plunged under, disoriented and spinning, but surfaced fast. Elena and Mick were already swimming toward the current edge of the tether line, a floating ring that used to moor small subvessels during ROV operations. We clung to it as the water around us began to change. A low boom echoed beneath us. Then came the blast. The rig erupted behind us in a deep, concussive roar that seemed to pull the air from our lungs even from this distance. A ball of flame rose from the belly of the platform, curling into the night sky. The pontoons breached, sending up twin geysers of fire and black smoke. The structure shuddered, steel groaning like an ancient beast, and began to tilt. The derrick collapsed first, folding sideways and slamming into the main deck with a violent crash. Steel splintered. The helideck crumpled and fell into the ocean. The flames rose higher, feeding on diesel fumes and oxygen. We kicked away from the wreckage as fast as we could, using the floating mooring line as support. Heat licked across the water's surface. Burning droplets landed around us like molten hail. But we were alive. We floated for hours, too exhausted to talk, too numb to feel anything. The Gulf was warm, but our bodies were drained. At some point, we saw the Port Royal again, still several miles away, now stopped dead in the water. It must have seen the explosion. Probably even felt it. There was no way the crew could ignore it now. I took the waterproof marine radio from my vest pouch, toggled to channel 16, and keyed in a short message. "This is Will Calder, former crew of Deepwater Titan. We have survivors. Rig is gone. Biological hazard eliminated. Request recovery." Static. Then, finally, a voice crackled and cautious. A woman's voice, professional but strained. "This is Port Royal Bridge. We have you on scope, survivors. Confirm biological threat neutralized?" "Yes," I said. "But stay clear of the wreck. Keep everyone on your ship locked down until you've decontaminated us. And make sure no one else boards anything out here, ever again." "Copy that, Titan. Bringing you aboard now. Hold position." They brought us aboard with full PPE protocols. Hazmat suits, isolation chambers, the works. We were placed in a negative pressure tent in the ship's forward medical bay. The captain, Andrea Voigt, never even removed her helmet when she spoke to us. She didn't have to. I could see in her eyes that she understood. Something worse than infection had taken root on that rig, something unnatural. Not just a virus, but a mutation of memory, of cognition. A kind of hunger that wore the face of people you once knew. They told us the mainland was gone silent, that the last messages from Houston and New Orleans had come 3 days ago. That offshore platforms were going dark one by one. They didn't know what the future held. But I did. It's adrift, just over the horizon, waiting for someone to open the wrong door. Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like and subscribe. Your support keeps these creepypastas coming. Until next time, stay alert, stay safe, and never ignore the feeling that something is watching.